The phone call came on a Wednesday, and I remember it was a Wednesday because I had just gotten home from my second job, the one I'd taken on 18 months earlier to pay off the medical debt from my mother's hip surgery. The surgery I had organized, the surgeon I had researched, the insurance gap I had personally covered out of my own savings account, while my sister Diane sent a flower arrangement and a card that said, "Thinking of you, Mama." I remember setting my keys on the counter. I remember my feet hurting. I remember thinking, just for a second, that I was tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix anymore. And then my phone rang. It was my mother, Carolyn. And before I could even finish saying hello, she said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to not make it into a whole thing." That sentence right there. If you have ever been the responsible one in a family that mistakes your reliability for emotional simplicity, you know exactly what that sentence means. It means something has already been decided, and you are the last to know, and we are all hoping you will absorb it quietly. I told her I was listening. She told me she had signed the house over to Diane. The house. The 4-bedroom house in Claremont that my father had spent 30 years paying off. The house I had grown up in. The house I had repainted, replumbed, and re-roofed over the past decade, while Diane was, and I want to be precise here, living in Scottsdale, doing yoga, and calling every other Sunday. That house. Signed over. I didn't say anything for a moment. I was doing the math in my head. Not the emotional math, not yet, but the actual math. The hip surgery, the roof, the time I had taken off work to drive her to physical therapy 3 times a week for 4 months. The $14,000 I had quietly spent keeping that house standing while she and Diane told each other I was just the responsible one. Like it was a personality trait. Like it wasn't a choice I made over and over at significant personal cost because I loved her. I finally asked her why, and Carolyn, my mother, the woman I had organized my entire adult life around protecting, said, "Diane needs the stability more than you do. You've always been able to handle things." There it is. You've always been able to handle things. I want you to really sit with that sentence for a second, because it is the most elegant trap ever constructed for a certain kind of woman. The woman who shows up. The woman who follows through. The woman who doesn't make it a whole thing. She gets told, again and again, that her competence is proof she doesn't need anything. And so she is given nothing. And somehow, that is supposed to make sense. I told my mother I understood. I told her I appreciated her calling to let me know. I told her to have a good night. And then I hung up the phone, sat down on my kitchen floor, still in my coat, still in my shoes, and I stayed there for a while. Now, I want you to stay with me here, because if you're thinking this story ends with me crying at a mediator's table and walking away with nothing, you don't know what kind of woman I am yet. Hit that subscribe button and tap the bell, because around here, we don't skip chapters. And this chapter, this one does not end the way Carolyn expected. Not even close. Let's keep going. What I haven't told you yet is what I found 3 days later when I drove to that house for what I told myself was the last time. Just to see it, just to say goodbye to it, the way you say goodbye to something before you decide what to do about losing it. I found a folder, a green manila folder, sitting on the top shelf of the hall closet, behind a box of my father's old tax returns. A folder that my mother did not know I knew existed. A folder that my father had told me about, quietly, privately, 2 weeks before he died, because he had known, even then, that something like this might happen. He had known about Diane a lot longer than any of us realized. And that folder changed everything. Let me tell you about Diane. Diane is 51 years old. She is 14 months older than me, which she has referenced, unprompted, at nearly every family gathering since we were teenagers, as though being born first was an achievement she'd earned, rather than a biological accident she'd survived. She has highlights that cost $400 every 6 weeks, a laugh that arrives slightly too late to be genuine, and the particular gift of making every room feel like it was designed for her comfort specifically. She is not a villain in the way villains are written in movies. She is something quieter and more corrosive than that. She is the kind of person who never does the work and never stops accepting the credit. Who calls at exactly the right moments, the moments other people will remember, and disappears at all the moments that actually matter. She did not come when our father was dying. She sent a fruit basket. She did not contribute to the roof. She said she was going through something financially. She did not sit in the surgical waiting room for 6 hours while our mother's hip was being reconstructed. She sent the flower arrangement, the one that said, "Thinking of you, Mama." But here's what Diane is very, very good at. She is good at the phone call. The warm, perfectly timed phone call where she asks Carolyn about her shows and her garden and whether the neighbor's dog is still getting into the flower beds. She has the patience, or perhaps the strategy, to invest in the small intimacies, the ones that don't cost anything, the ones that feel like love if you don't look too closely. And Carolyn, who had spent 40 years being adored by a husband who never once made her feel difficult, was not equipped to look closely. She wanted to be loved by both of her daughters, and one of us made that effortless. And one of us was always driving her to physical therapy. I don't say that to be cruel. I say it because I need you to understand the ecosystem in which that house transfer happened. It did not happen in a single moment. It happened across 1,000 small moments in which Diane was present in the ways that feel like love, and I was present in the ways that look like obligation. And from the outside, from Carolyn's inside, they stopped looking different a long time ago. Now, the folder. My father's name was Gerald. Gerald was a man of almost no words and absolute precision. He was an accountant for 31 years. He believed in documentation the way some people believe in prayer. Not because it was warm or comforting, but because it was the only thing that told the truth without flinching. 2 weeks before he died, he was 69. It was pancreatic cancer. It moved fast. He called me into the bedroom while Carolyn was at the pharmacy. He was lucid. He was tired. And he was careful. He said, "There's a folder in the hall closet, behind the tax returns. I need you to know it's there. I need you to not touch it until you need it." I asked him what was in it. He looked at me for a long moment and he said, "Everything I should have said out loud 20 years ago." And then Carolyn came home and he closed his eyes and we never spoke about it again. He died 11 days later. I had not touched that folder in 4 years. I had thought about it, maybe more than I should admit, but I had respected what he asked. I had waited. Because that is what I do. I wait. I absorb. I handle things. But standing in that hall closet, 3 days after my mother called me to tell me she had given the house to Diane, I decided I was done waiting. I pulled the box of tax returns off the shelf, and there it was, green, manila, unmarked on the outside, thicker than I expected. I carried it to the kitchen table, the same kitchen table where my father used to do the household books every Sunday morning, coffee going, glasses on, pencil behind his ear, and I sat down and I opened it. The first thing inside was a letter, handwritten, my father's handwriting, that precise architectural print he used for everything, the handwriting of a man who believed that how you wrote something said something about how seriously you meant it. It was addressed to me, not to both of us, not to the family, to me, just me. My full name at the top, and then underneath it a date, written 18 months before he died. Which means he had known for at least 18 months before he died that something was wrong, that something needed to be corrected before he left, that there was a version of this family's story that had not yet been told, and that he was the only one left who could tell it. I have a rule about moments that change everything. I believe they almost never feel like what they are when they arrive. They feel ordinary. They feel like a Tuesday afternoon in a kitchen that smells like old coffee and whatever you had for lunch. They do not arrive with music. They do not announce themselves. But I want you to hold on to this one. Because what my father wrote in that letter, what he had documented, dated, and quietly assembled over 18 months, is going to reframe everything you think you know about Diane, about Carolyn, and about that house. And I mean everything. The letter was 4 pages long. My father did not waste words, which means 4 pages from Gerald was the equivalent of a confession from anyone else. I'm going to tell you what was in it, but I need you to understand something first. Reading your dead father's handwriting is a specific kind of grief that I was not prepared for that afternoon. It is not the sharp grief of the funeral, or the hollow grief of the first holidays without them. It is quieter than that. It is the grief of hearing their voice again, that precise, careful voice, coming at you through ink on paper, from a version of them that was already dying when they wrote it, and knew it, and wrote it anyway. I held it together, barely. The letter began with an apology. My father, a man who, in 69 years of living, had apologized to me exactly twice that I could recall, opened with, "I am sorry it took me this long to say what I should have said when it still would have mattered." And then he told me about the money. Diane had borrowed from them, not once, not twice. Over the course of 11 years, across 9 separate transactions, all of them framed as emergencies, all of them promised back, none of them returned. Diane had taken $83,000 from my parents' savings account. $83,000. Gerald had documented every transfer. Date, amount, the reason Diane gave, the method of repayment promised. He had kept the text messages where she asked. He had kept the emails where she confirmed. He had kept the bank records showing the withdrawals. He had kept everything. Because Gerald was an accountant, and Gerald did not trust the version of a story that lived only in someone's memory. He wrote that he had confronted Diane once, just once, near the end, when he understood he was running out of time. He had asked her to sign a promissory note acknowledging the debt. He had told her it was for the estate. He had told her it was just paperwork, just formality, nothing personal. She had signed it. He had that too, in the folder, notarized. He wrote that he had not told Carolyn the full amount because he did not want her to choose between her daughters in whatever time he had left. He wrote that he had not told me because he did not want me to carry it while he was still alive. He wrote that he was telling me now because he was afraid, and this is the word he used, Afraid. A word I had never once heard my father say out loud. He was afraid that when he was gone, the balance would tip in a direction he could no longer correct. He was right. I need to stop here for just a moment, because I have been sitting with this story for a long time. Years, actually. And there is something about reading that word, afraid, in my father's handwriting that I have never fully been able to put down. My father was a man who handled things quietly, precisely, without drama, without complaint. Sound familiar? I come by it honestly, apparently. And what I keep thinking about, what I keep coming back to, is how many of us are raised in families where the ones who show up the most get protected the least. Where reliability gets mistaken for invincibility. Where the person who never asks for anything eventually stops being asked if they need anything. If that is sitting somewhere in your chest right now, I see you. I really do. My father saw me. He just ran out of time to say it while he was still breathing. Okay, back to the folder. Because there was something else inside it. Something underneath the letter, underneath the bank records, underneath the notarized promissory note. Something I had not expected. Something that told me my father had not just documented the past. He had planned for exactly this moment. Beneath everything else in that folder was a single sheet of paper, legal size, typed, not handwritten, which told me he had drafted it somewhere official, or at least with deliberate formality. At the top, it read, Addendum to Last Will and Testament of Gerald Raymond Hutchins. It was dated. It was signed. It was witnessed by two signatures I did not recognize, neighbors, I would later learn, from 2 streets over. People Diane had never met, people who had no reason to lie for anyone. The addendum was simple, 1 paragraph. It stated that in the event of Gerald's death, the family home at its current appraised value was to be considered a partial offset against any outstanding personal debt owed to the estate by any named beneficiary. Any named beneficiary. Diane had signed a promissory note for $83,000. The house, at the time of Gerald's death, had been appraised at $214,000, which meant that if the addendum was valid, and I was going to need a lawyer to tell me whether it was, Diane did not own that house. Diane owed money on it, and she had absolutely no idea that document existed. I did not sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen table until 2 a.m. with the folder open in front of me, reading everything twice, then a third time, the way you reread something when your brain keeps insisting it cannot possibly say what it clearly says. By midnight, I had made a list. Not an emotional list, not the list of grievances I had been quietly composing in the back of my mind for 4 years. An actual list, practical, sequential, the kind of list Gerald would have made. I think that was the first moment I understood that my father had not just left me a folder, he had left me a blueprint. Item 1. Find a probate attorney. Not a general practice lawyer, not a family friend with a law degree, a probate attorney, specifically, someone who understood estate law well enough to tell me within the first 15 minutes whether that addendum was enforceable or whether it was just a grieving man's wishful thinking typed onto a piece of paper. Item 2. Do not tell Carolyn. Not yet. Not until I knew what I was working with. Because Carolyn had already proven, not out of malice, but out of a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from decades of keeping peace in a family that only has peace when someone is absorbing the damage, that she would call Diane the moment she felt the ground shift. And I could not afford for Diane to know the ground was shifting. Item 3. Get the house appraised independently. Whatever Gerald's figure was, I needed a current number, because property values in Claremont had moved significantly in 4 years. And if this came down to numbers, and I was beginning to understand that it absolutely would, I needed my numbers to be airtight. I called the attorney's office at 8 the next morning. Her name was Beverly. 40 years in probate law, recommended by a colleague of mine whose mother had gone through a contested estate 2 years prior. Beverly's assistant told me the earliest available consultation was 3 weeks out. 3 weeks. I said fine. I booked it. And then I did something I am not entirely proud of, but I am not entirely ashamed of either. I called Diane. I called Diane because I needed to know how much she knew. Not about the folder, she couldn't know about that, but about the transfer itself. How Carolyn had framed it to her, whether she had a lawyer involved, whether she was already making plans for the property. Diane answered on the second ring, which told me she had been expecting calls. People who have just received something valuable tend to stay close to their phones. She was warm, immediately, performatively warm, in that way she has, the slight uplift in her voice, the, "Oh, it's so good to hear from you," the careful brightness of someone who is managing a situation and believes they are managing it well. I was warm back. I have had a lot of practice. I told her I had spoken to Mama. I told her I just wanted to understand the situation a little better, for my own peace of mind. I told her I was not upset. I used exactly those words, I am not upset. Because I needed her relaxed. I needed her talking. And Diane, who had spent decades in a family where I was the responsible one and she was the one who needed stability, Diane believed me immediately. Because why wouldn't she? I was always the one who handled things and moved on. I was always the one who made it easy. She told me Carolyn had approached her about it 6 months ago. 6 months. Which meant the conversation had been happening for half a year, while I was driving to my second job and paying off medical debt and telling myself that surely the family I had spent my adult life showing up for was going to show up for me eventually. 6 months. She told me there was no lawyer involved. Carolyn had used the same notary she'd used for years, a woman named Patrice who worked out of a UPS store on Foothill Boulevard. She told me the deed had already been transferred. And then, and this is the part I want you to hold on to, she said, "I know this is hard for you, but honestly, you've always landed on your feet. You don't need it the way I do." There it was again. You've always landed on your feet. I wonder sometimes if Diane and Carolyn had rehearsed that line together, or if it had simply calcified over years into the family's official position on my resilience. Either way, they had given me the thing I needed most in that moment, which was confirmation that they had no idea what was in that folder. No idea that Gerald had spent 18 months quietly assembling a document that said, in the precise language of a man who trusted paperwork above all else, "This is not over." I told Diane it meant a lot to hear her say that. I told her I hoped she'd be happy in the house. I told her to give Mama my love. And then I hung up, and I opened my laptop, and I started reading everything I could find about promissory notes and estate addenda and the enforceability of informal debt offset clauses in California probate proceedings. 3 weeks felt like a long time to wait for Beverly, so I decided to use every single day of it. Here is what I learned in the 3 weeks between booking that appointment and sitting across from Beverly in her office on the 14th floor of a building downtown that smelled like old wood and serious money. I learned that what my father had created was unusual. Beverly would use exactly that word, unusual, when she finally read it. But unusual in probate law does not mean unenforceable. It means interesting. And Beverly, I would discover, found it very interesting indeed. What I had not expected, what none of us had anticipated, not me, not Beverly, and certainly not Diane, was what Beverly found when she pulled the full probate record on my father's estate. Because it turned out that the addendum was not the only thing Gerald had filed. There was something else. Something submitted to the court 8 months before he died, quietly, without fanfare, the way Gerald did everything, that changed the legal architecture of this entire situation in a way that made the folder look like the beginning of the story, rather than the end of it. He had amended the trust. Beverly set down the probate record and looked at me across her desk, with the particular expression of a woman who has spent 40 years in a field where surprises are rare and almost never good. This expression was different. This one had something underneath it that took me a moment to identify. It was respect. She said, "Your father was either very lucky or very deliberate. In my experience, men like this are never lucky." I told her I knew. Here is what Gerald had done. 8 months before he died, while he was still well enough to drive himself to appointments and sign his own name without assistance, he had visited the attorney who had drafted the original family trust, a man named Philip, semi-retired, who had known my father for 20 years and asked no unnecessary questions. He had asked Philip to amend the trust in one specific surgical way. The original trust had named Carolyn as the sole trustee upon Gerald's death, with full discretionary authority over all trust assets. Standard language. Reasonable for a marriage of 41 years. The kind of clause that assumes the surviving spouse will act in the interest of the family as a whole. The kind of clause that assumes the surviving spouse will not, 6 months after the funeral, sign a 4-bedroom house over to one daughter and call the other one to tell her not to make it a whole thing. The amendment changed the trustee structure. Carolyn remained a trustee, but the amendment added a co-trustee, required to sign off on any disposition of real property held by the trust. That co-trustee was me. My father had made me co-trustee of the family trust 8 months before he died, and he had told no one. Not Carolyn, not Diane, not me. He had filed it, sealed it into the probate record, and left it there. The way you leave something in a wall safe that only one person knows the combination to, except the combination was Beverly's name and a consultation appointment and the green manila folder he'd told me about from his deathbed. He had built a lock, and then he had handed me the key without telling me what it opened. Beverly set the document down and folded her hands and said, "The transfer your mother executed with Diane is not valid. A disposition of real property held in trust requires the signature of all named trustees. Your mother signed alone, which means legally, the house never moved." The house never moved. I want to tell you that I felt triumphant in that moment. I want to tell you it felt like justice arriving on schedule, clean and satisfying, the way it does in the stories we tell ourselves about how things should work. But that is not what I felt. What I felt was tired. The specific, cellular tiredness of a woman who has been right about something painful for a very long time and has just received official confirmation that she was right and discovered that being right does not actually fix the part of you that had to survive being wronged in the first place. I thought about my father in that semi-retired attorney's office 8 months before he died, making sure that if Carolyn's grief made her careless, if Diane's talent for warm phone calls outlasted Gerald's ability to counterbalance it, there would be something in the record, something with his signature on it that said, "Not without her. Not without me." I have turned that over many times since. The question of whether he should have told me, whether he should have told Carolyn, whether the better version of this story is one where he sat us all down while he still could and said what needed to be said out loud in a room where everyone had to hear it. Maybe. Probably even. But Gerald was not built for that room. He was built for documentation and precision, and the quiet certainty that the paperwork would hold when the people couldn't. And the paperwork held. Beverly sent a formal letter to the notary, Patrice, and to the county recorder's office that same week. She sent a copy to Carolyn. Certified mail, return receipt requested, the way you send something when you need to know exactly when it was received and by whom. Carolyn called me 40 minutes after Beverly's tracking notification showed it had been delivered. She was not warm on that call. She was not the measured, careful woman who had told me not to make it a whole thing. She was frightened, and when Carolyn was frightened, she became loud in the particular way of someone who has always been able to resolve discomfort by raising the emotional temperature of a room until everyone else backs down. I let her talk. I had learned, from Gerald I think, though I had not known I was learning it at the time, that the most important thing you can do when someone is telling you how you should feel is to say very little and remember everything. She told me I was being vindictive. She told me this was tearing the family apart. She told me that Diane needed the house, and I had never needed anything the way Diane did, which was, and I want to note the extraordinary irony of this, presented as though it were a compliment. And when she finally stopped, I said, "Mama, I am not trying to take anything from Diane. I am trying to make sure that what Daddy built for this family is distributed the way Daddy intended. If Diane wants to have a conversation about the estate, about all of it, including what she borrowed and never returned, I am ready for that conversation. I have always been ready for that conversation." Silence. The silence of a woman who has just understood for the first time that the thing she thought she was managing had already been managed by someone else, months ago. By a man in a semi-retired attorney's office who loved her enough to protect her from her own worst decisions even after he was gone. She asked me what I meant by what Diane borrowed. And I told her I thought it was time the three of us sat down together, with Beverly present, with everything on the table. All $83,000 of it. Diane was on a plane from Scottsdale 4 days later. She did not know yet what was waiting for her at that table. She did not know about the promissory note. She did not know about the trust amendment. She did not know that the house she had already started calling her house, to her friends, to her yoga instructor, to the contractor she had called about a kitchen renovation, had never legally been hers for a single day. But she was about to find out. The meeting happened on a Thursday morning in Beverly's conference room, 10th floor, a long table with water glasses nobody touched, and a view of the city that nobody looked at. Carolyn sat at one end in her good coat, the navy one she wore to funerals and serious occasions, her hands folded in her lap, her face arranged into the careful neutrality of a woman who has not yet decided which side of the room she is on. Diane arrived 7 minutes late. She came in the way she always came into rooms, slightly breathless, slightly luminous, the faint performance of a woman who knows she is being watched and has spent a lifetime making that work in her favor. She set her bag down. She looked at Beverly. She looked at me. And for just a fraction of a second, so brief I almost missed it, something moved across her face that was not her usual composure. She had expected a conversation. She had not expected a conference room. She had not expected Beverly's particular brand of stillness, the stillness of a woman who has seen every version of this scene and is not moved by any of them. Beverly did not preamble. She was not built for preamble either. She laid 3 documents on the table in a single, precise motion: the trust amendment, the promissory note, the addendum to the will. She gave Diane 60 seconds to read the first page of each before she said, "I'll give you a moment to consult with your own counsel before we continue." If you don't have representation, I'd strongly recommend you arrange some before this conversation goes further. Diane looked at the promissory note for a long time, her own signature at the bottom, notarized, dated, 8 years ago, for the largest single amount, $31,000, when she had called our parents from Scottsdale saying the business she had invested in had collapsed and she needed help and she would pay it back within 18 months. She had never paid back a single dollar. She looked up at me, and I want to be careful here about how I describe what passed between us in that moment, because it was not triumphant. It was not satisfying in any clean way. It was the look of a woman recognizing for the first time that the sister she had spent decades categorizing as reliable and therefore manageable had been paying attention the entire time, had inherited something from their father that was not money, not property, not anything you could transfer with a notary stamp on Foothill Boulevard. She had inherited his understanding that the truth, properly documented, will outlast any story you try to tell about it. I will not walk you through every hour of what followed. Estates are slow. Lawyers are expensive. Feelings take longest of all. What I will tell you is this. Diane did retain counsel, a younger attorney who came in sharp and left considerably less sharp after 2 meetings with Beverly. The deed transfer was formally voided by the court. The house went back into the trust, where it had always legally belonged. And then we negotiated. Because that is what families do, even broken ones. Even ones sitting across conference tables with water glasses nobody touches. We negotiated what was fair, what Gerald had intended, what the numbers actually said when you put all of them in the same room at the same time. The house was sold. Not to Diane, not kept by me. Sold. Because none of us, not even Carolyn, once she understood the full picture, could agree on what it meant to anyone anymore. The proceeds were split according to Beverly's interpretation of the amended trust, offset against Diane's documented debt. After the offset, Diane's share was considerably smaller than she had anticipated. Mine was considerably larger. Carolyn received her portion in full, as Gerald had always intended, because Gerald had loved his wife with the specific devotion of a man who understood her limitations and planned around them rather than punishing her for them. I choose to see that as romantic, most days. The part I think about most is not the money. It is not even the house, really. The house is wood and drywall and memories that belong to all of us in ways no deed can fully capture or fully sever. The part I think about most is my father, sitting in Philip's office 8 months before he died, making me co-trustee without telling me, assembling that folder with the precision of a man who had spent 31 years believing that if you documented something correctly, the truth of it would survive you. He was right. It did. And I think about the women in my family, Carolyn, Diane, me, and how differently the same set of circumstances shaped each of us. How Carolyn's love expressed itself as peacekeeping, sometimes at the cost of fairness. How Diane's insecurity expressed itself as entitlement, sometimes at the cost of honesty. And how mine expressed itself as showing up, over and over, at significant personal cost, and trusting that someone was paying attention. Someone was. He just ran out of time to say so while he was still here. Gerald said it the only way he had left. in a green manila folder, behind a box of tax returns, in a hall closet of a house on a street in Claremont. It was enough. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight. If any part of this story sat heavy in your chest, if you recognized yourself in the woman who always handled things, who was always told she didn't need anything because she was so capable of surviving without it, I see you. You don't have to explain it. You don't have to justify it. Some families just never learned how to love the ones who made love look easy. And that was never your fault. If this one found you at the right moment, share it with someone who needs to hear it tonight. Leave a comment below. I read every single one. And if you're not subscribed yet, well, you've been here this long. You know what we do here. Around here, we don't just survive it. We understand it. And then we let it go. She didn't win by fighting louder. She won by knowing more. Remember that. I'll see you by the fire.